Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Everywhere Book Fest. I'm Karyn Parsons, and I will be moderating today's panel, Black Voices Matter. I am very excited to be here today with some authors that I'm a huge fan of, and I know I haven't gushed over all of you yet so much, but I will tell you I'm a huge fan of all of you. So this is going to be a really nice panel, really good panel. When we start, I want to go down the line first and introduce everybody. If you can introduce yourselves and then tell me a little bit about your most recent book. Actually, let me first just say everybody who's here with us. We've got Vashti Harrison, Jason Reynolds, Jewell Parker Rhodes, and our good friend Brian. So everybody, I do want to go down the line and have you tell us a little bit about your most recent book. My most recent book is my first novel, which is How High the Moon. It's a historical coming-of-age story set in the Jim Crow era, South Carolina. And it's about a fictional mixed-race girl, Ella, who learns some family truths in the story, some surprising family truths and some tragic truths about society. And when her classmate, George Stinney, is arrested for a horrible crime. But I want to go around and ask everybody else to tell us a little bit. Vashti, could you go first?
Yeah. So my name is Vashti Harrison. I'm an author and illustrator. My most recent book is Little Legends, Exceptional Men in Black History. It's a nonfiction book, a collection of biographies of Black men around the world. And it's the third in a collection of books that feature really awesome people in history.
My name is Jason Reynolds. And my latest book is Stamped: Racism, Anti-Racism in You, which is nonfiction and is a sort of translation of Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's academic tome, which is called Stamped from the Beginning. And the whole purpose of the book is basically to, for the first time, create something that feels like scholarship, but scholarship written with young people in mind. It gives the overall definitive history of race in America from the 1400s all the way up to 2016, and talking about why we are where we are and why we are who we are in America today as it pertains to race, but written specifically with our teenagers and our middle schoolers at the forefront, with them sort of in mind.
I am such a fan of all of your work, and I'm honored to be here with you. My name's Jewell Parker Rhodes, and my latest book is Black Brother, Black Brother. And it's about two brothers who are biracial, and one is fair-skinned and one is dark-skinned. And they both go to a private school, and the one who has color in his skin is subject to colorism, racial bias, and bullying. He's also arrested at school for something that he didn't do. And I make a case for how the school to prison pipeline really challenges equity for children of color in schools. But my young man, Dante, decides that he's going to get back at the bully and demonstrate through fencing, which is actually not just a white aristocratic sport, but a sport made famous by tremendous, wonderful men of color and women of color. And he becomes a champion. But more importantly, he becomes so secure in his own identity. And he learns that you always have to be you. And it's everybody else's problem if they can't see your glory.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, all of you. I want to go around. I want to start actually. Jason, I have to ask you this. I think what you've taken on with Stamped is pretty incredible. And I have to ask, after working so long in fiction, doing so many books in fiction, what made you decide to do Stamped and to bring this to kids? What made you decide to take on nonfiction that way?
I didn't want to. It's definitely not in the plan.
Oh,
definitely not in the plans. So what actually happened? Dr. Kendi, he asked me to.
Uh,
He when Stamped from the Beginning came out and became a huge success, and it won the National Book Award. 6 months later, we were like sitting at a bar in DC, and he was like, "Look, I need you to do this for me. I need you to take this thing that I made, and I need you to make it more accessible for young people and for everyone else." And I said no, because one, I see myself as a fiction writer. Two, because I know when I'm out of my depth, right? I'm not a person who sort of sees himself as some giant. I'm fully aware of what my strengths and weaknesses are. I wasn't a very good student. I don't know how to study. I don't know how to research. I don't like these aren't muscles that I have that I've developed, and so I didn't want to ruin this thing that he spent his whole life working on. So I said no, and he asked me again, and I said no again, and he asked me a third time, and it was the third time. It was the third time that I sort of acquiesced, only because I realized that it was bigger than the both of us. It was bigger than him. It was bigger than my own insecurities and fears. And perhaps he saw something that I didn't see in myself, and maybe I could give it a shot. It took a long time, because I was so afraid and intimidated by the work that I kept sort of presenting edited versions of his book, but it just wasn't cool enough, and it wasn't fresh enough, and there was no music to it. It was like a text, a smaller textbook, basically.
Yes.
And finally, after I had gone to New York to tell him our editor that I was going to quit, that I was going to sort of pay back the advance and kind of pull out of the project, because I felt like I was drowning. And she said, "Listen, you keep giving us versions of his book, but we asked you, we picked you because we want you to do your thing. Like, we know what you do, we know who you are, we know how you work, and sort of what you bring to the table. So just do your thing." And I told her, if you want me to do my thing, then I have to ruin what he's done. I have to ruin it, which is why the book starts, "This is not a history book," because in order for me to fall into, like, settle into myself, I had to subvert everything that people thought his book was and think his book is. And so that's how it kind of happened. And 2 months later, I was done. So.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And I know the history is, it's so important, but it's also very intimidating. Like you're saying, you're talking about how you were as a student, and I can relate to that feeling of feeling a little intimidated by going into a history, telling. And I like the way you've gone about doing it. Vashti, I wanted to ask you, with your Little Leaders books, with the Little Leaders and Little Legends, it's history. These are historical figures that you're doing. And I have to say, I really love the way, I think I heard you talking about how you kind of made you illustrated them so that each character, each figure really is kind of the same figure, as kind of taking on each person. Is that making sense? I'm not saying the way you said it, but I loved that. I really loved that. And because it's kind of like all of us get to be all of these different people. But how do you choose who you're going to? How do you research, and how do you choose and decide on who's going to be in the books?
Yeah, it's not easy. I'm not a historian, and sort of in the same way that Jason is talking about how to approach big history in this way, it's intimidating. What I felt like I wanted to make was a book that would be exciting for a little me, like a little Vashti. And Vashti didn't care much for history because it seemed boring and it didn't seem like it was for her. And so I wanted to make it feel sweet and inviting. And I thought I can use adorable characters to bring people in and to bring adult Vashti in, because here's a way that I can finally get excited about history. In the end, what I did was try to assess, how can I show this wide range of people in history while covering important figures, but also showcasing all these different fields of study and opportunities, because kids are constantly bombarded with this question of what do they want to be when they grow up. so
Yes.
early on.
Right.
So, you know, as I was assessing what kinds of stories would have been important for me to see when I was young, I definitely spent so much time in my childhood, you know, questioning art, whether or not I could make art a career, what I wanted to do, what I wanted to study, how I was going to get out of my small town. These were big questions to be asking of a kid. So I wanted to make sure I showcased, here is a doctor and a lawyer, sure, but here's also an engineer and an astronaut and a photographer and a filmmaker, just to show that there are all these different ways towards finding your path in life, and making sure that I was showcasing, you know, a wide breadth of, you know, important historical figures. So it was just a lot of, you know, thinking about what kid needs this story? What, you know, are there kids out here that need to know that Mae Jemison loved to dance when she was a little kid? Although she was the first African-American woman in space, she also loved to dance. Like, that's really important to know.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm thinking a lot about that kid reader. What's going to excite them? What's going to make them want to turn the page and think, oh my gosh, that's so cute, I want to be an engineer. And like, imagining that a 6-year-old knows the word engineer, because I certainly didn't when I was that age.
Right, but you did. It was so great. It is really great through your illustrations, the way you pull us in, the way you pull kids in, and make them so appealing. And because it's so cute and so sweet and accessible, it's not intimidating. You know what we were talking about. So yeah, I think you've done a really great job with that too. Jewell, you in Ghost Boys, you took on telling the story of Emmett Till, which I think, or telling a much larger story, but bringing Emmett Till's story in, and I think that had to be so daunting, I think, and difficult. And I don't know, maybe it wasn't, but I would imagine that it was. And I was wondering what made you decide to tell that story, to bring that story into Ghost Boys.
Well, I'm identifying with Jason because when my editor said, after I'd written about 9/11, she literally said, Jewell, do you want to write about the murder of young Black boys? And it's like, no. And I kept saying, no. But I had, you know, shared moments in my life and fears for my son. So she knew that this was an important matter to me. And actually, it was enormously difficult trying to figure out how to get into the story. And what really helped me was the fact that I was alive. I was a kid when Emmett Till was murdered. And in those days, you know, the family had Ebony and Jet and the TV shows, and kids saw everything. I still remember seeing his body. I still remember seeing pictures of lynchings, and those have been with me my entire life. Yes, and just the trauma from it. And now I'm a grandmother, and I thought of Trayvon, you know, Tamir, Laquan, so many others. Why are young Black boys, young Black men still dying? And that historical scope was important to me. And so I immediately thought of ghosts. You know, every goodbye ain't gone. You know, the spirit is with you. That, you know, the distance between the living and the dead is very slim. That was how I was taught by my Georgia hoodoo grandmother. And I remember telling my editor, ghosts. I can write it if I use ghosts. And later on, she told me she thought I had lost my mind. She was really worried about me. But that entryway point of bearing witness, and also the idea that I didn't want them just to be victims, that I wanted to honor that they themselves had a power and that their lives and their deaths mattered. So the whole idea of this image of a tribe of all these souls lost, who are demanding of the living that we do better, you know, make life better and be less racist, became a very compelling way for me to finally tell that story. But it was begging for youth today, change this. I thought it was going to change during my lifetime. And I've lived long enough to know, nope, It has not changed. So there's work to be done. And unfortunately, my generation, we didn't finish it. So I turned it to youth, the young people.
Yeah, that's great. I know that I've heard you talk about, and I would ask you, well, ask everybody about this. But Jewell, I'll start with you. I know that you've talked about how it's such a difficult subject, and adults read it, and we're heartbroken, and we cry, and we're so upset.
Mm-hmm.
But then I read you saying that the kids actually, the reaction from kids is a little bit different. It's not always that they're so broken or heartbroken when they read it. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I think that there's ways in which that power of bearing witness, that becomes the tool for kids to hold on to and to feel that they are in fact empowered, so that there is a charge that the dead have made upon them, and that as living souls. And sometimes I'll ask kids in the schoolroom, how many folks are in here are living? And they'll all raise their hand. So what does that mean? That I can make it better. Yeah. And that empowerment, I think, is critical. And that connection back to memory becomes a good thing that affirms them. And it's not just about the individual, but it's how a community of people cross racial lines can come together and can make a real difference. I think it also mattered that I was able to tell Emmett Till's story in a way that clearly showed his innocence. If you go through, Wikipedia or even other books that have been written for youth or written for adults, there was always a suggestion that somehow or another, he might have whistled. He might have said, "Hey, baby," that somehow he might have been just the slightest bit, and this is absolutely ridiculous, responsible for what happened to him, And it amazes me that narrative, more than anything else, has been so destructive to the concept of being a child and being empowered as a child. And the book was actually done when I finally read, the book, The Blood of Emmett Till, in which, Miss Bryant said he hadn't done anything. And I said, "Give me my book back." And I was able to reclaim his innocence. And I'm able to say to children, and children understand this, does a child ever deserve to be, hurt? And they go, "No." And so bringing home that idea that they have space to grow, and they also ought to have space in this world to be nurtured and cared for in terms of adulthood. And for all those lives that have been lost, that they have an even greater obligation to make their own lives count and matter. Yeah. I love the kids so much. And I think fifth graders in particular are like a sweet spot. When I die, I'm going to come back as a fifth grade teacher.
That's great. That's great. So I know all of you have worked with young people, and you've witnessed how they are absorbing Black stories and ideas of Blackness now. Jason, like I said before, I think it's really interesting that you didn't decide, but that they finally got you to do Stamped. But what do you think the kids, and not just in nonfiction, obviously, in fiction as well, what do you think the kids are looking for in stories and books? And what work do you think still needs to be done to make them feel represented?
I think kids are looking for truth. I think what we normally say is kids are looking for representation, but I think the part of that representation that they're looking for is truth, right? Because it's not that Black people, specifically, it's not that Black people don't see Black people, it's that Black people don't see Black people as we are, right? We see slivers and thin slices of our identities, sent through some sort of perverse, almost like a whitenizer, right? And turned into propagandized versions of ourselves, when the truth of the matter is that we're whole, we're human beings, and which means that we get to be all the things, anything we want, to be. I used to always say that if you have a book where there's, or even in school, in real life, if there's a Black kid in the class, the only Black kid in the class, then he or she is expected to be the coolest kid in the class, or the toughest kid in the class. And the truth is that he or she deserves to be a weirdo and nerd and a misfit and read manga and Pokemon and play video games and skateboard and listen to rap music and listen to rock music. And like, we deserve to be all the things. And I think we deserve to be all the things because we already are. And so I think what young people want more than anything is just truth.
Yeah.
9 times out of 10, when I go to a school and I do a school visit, at the end of it, there's tons of young people who say, "Thank you for talking to us like humans."
Yes.
And not like children, right? Now, it's not that they're not children. It's that the term children, or when we think of them as children, we basically create caricatures for them, and we start speaking to them like they are half-formed people. Whereas all we have to do is respect them for where they are. They will always step up to the plate and meet us, right? If we can just give it to them straight. They're dying for honesty.
Right.
They're starving for it. And I think that's all, me personally, that's all I'm trying to give, just honest stories. That means that there can be struggle, but only if there is also laughter.
Right.
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 And that there can be jokes, but only if there's also insecurity. Right. All of those things have to live in the same space.
Right. Right. That's great. Vashti, I wanted to ask you about inspiration in your work, because we're very inspired by a lot of the people that are in the Little Leaders books. We're inspired by them a lot, but for you, I was wondering, are there artists or activists or just are there people, living or not, that inspire you?
I think, yeah, definitely. I feel like I'm getting inspiration from artists all the time. I try to consume a lot of media. I watched a lot of movies, and I go when it was possible. I went to art museums, and I read up a lot on, artists, people that I admire, and I try to bring that back into my work. But when I'm writing and when I decided to get into writing children's literature, I really, really am trying to put myself in that mindset of a kid, that young reader, and try to figure out what is going to be exciting and interesting for them, and what would have been exciting or interesting for me. And so when I take that inspiration into those books, like one person I wrote about was Andre Leon Talley, who was a fashion editor at Vogue. 6'6", big Black guy, like huge personality. And he's someone who inspires me because of where he's gone and all of the work that he's done. But when I'm reading his story and when I'm writing about him for kids, I'm looking at, what is there something in his childhood? Is there something in this story that, a random kid anywhere in the world or anywhere in America can connect to? And he was so inspired by the older women in his life, his grandmother and one of the former editors at Vogue. And I thought, it doesn't take a lot to get a kid interested in something. Literally, they switch interests all the time. One day they want to be, a rocket scientist, and the next day they want to be a fashion editor. And so I'm looking for just anything that can get them excited and make them feel like there's a version of yourself in here. You can see this version of you reflected back in the story. And he was raised by his grandmother, and a kid came up to me and was like, I'm raised by my grandmother. And it's like, it doesn't take a whole lot for you to connect with that story, for a kid to connect with that story, and to see like there are all these possibilities for yourself within that world. So I am trying to take, personal inspiration from the people that I meet and from the artists that I'm inspired by. But when I'm trying to reassess that for children, I'm really thinking about, what's the average kid, or what can any kid find for themselves in that story? Yeah.
I think that's so true. That's so important. I saw Andre Leon Talley on the street in New York once, and he stopped and did a double take at whatever I was wearing. I remember I I like to think he did. I don't know what he was looking at, but of course I thought, is he looking at my clothes? Anyway,
that would be amazing.
Yeah, it's funny, and he's this big man.
Cute.
But so Jewell, I want to ask you the same question. Or what about inspiration for you? I know, and I want to ask you in a minute. I wanted to ask you about Black Brother, Black Brother. I know you were inspired by your own sons, but are you also in your work? Do you find yourself inspired by other artists out there?
Oh, I actually have, as a writer, I get inspired by historical figures, you know, and in fact, I have pieces or things that I learned when I was like in my 20s that are still making their way into my novels now. So for example, I remember seeing, when I was trying to find my voice as a writer, because I grew up not knowing that Black people wrote books. I didn't know that till I was a junior in college. Right. And when I discovered that, it was like, okay, that's what I'm going to do. And I remember reading in Smithsonian Magazine about Alexander Dumas and seeing that he was a Black man. And I'm going, what? I didn't know that. And I've been wanting to write a story about him forever. He finally makes his appearance in a way in Black Brother, Black Brother. Right. But I think part of my impulse is still about reclaiming more stories that I didn't know. Like, how come I didn't know that? Or the Tulsa race riot. How come I didn't know that? You know, how come I didn't know that there was a Black woman named Marie Laveau, you know, who was the most powerful woman in New Orleans? You know, how come I don't know certain things? So I find it's more that trying to tell about the untold stories inspires me. And I remember seeing once like a film by an early Black filmmaker that was on the African water goddesses. And so they finally made it into a novel that I wrote called, you know, Bayou Magic. So for me, it's the sense of lives lived that somehow start winding their way inside of me. And that's where I get my stories from. And then the children who are in my story, the characters, they're actually inspired, except for my most recent book, by the kids that I meet. So they're not based on me, but they're based on the love, funny, you know, outrageous, terrific, compassionate kids that I meet in schools. Okay. Yes. So they inspired the characters, and then I have history inspire the stories.
Okay. Now I know that, like we said, with your latest book, Black Brother, Black Brother, that your sons inspired the story, and I was really wondering if, since that was the inspiration, but when you actually started writing it, were you surprised a lot? Were there like unexpected truths that came up, because you know you live with these people and with their situation and with things that go on in them?
There are parts of my children's stories, and it's actually a boy and a girl, that I don't tell because that's their story. Okay. But you know, my family is biracial, and the time that we got married, things were so scary to me that, you know, that I actually cried on my wedding day, and I said, okay, well, I'll marry you because you're my true love, and we've been together for 38 years, but we're not going to have any kids. And he says, oh no, we have to have kids because our kids are going to be awesome. But I was so scared, and it had, in my generation, racism pushing on me in such a way that it made me fearful. But we have these two wonderful kids, and sure enough, one looks like me and one looks like their dad. And the world, I have seen the world teach them in terms of what, or try to teach them what they think they ought to be based on this skin color. And that has been very upsetting to me. And they have their own personal stories and journeys, but there are challenges, you know, like, you know, when you have, you know, two brothers in the story, and one's, you know, they're the same DNA, they're the same, you know, they're brothers and sisters, but brothers, you know, brothers and brothers. And you know, how does the brother who's more privileged by society because of skin tone feel in terms of his relationship to his brother, you know, and vice versa? And of course, what I'm able to write is such love that they have and compassion for each other. And for them to turn, the problem is not inside them, not with them, but out there.
Right.
You know, so it was very healing, I think, for kids who are mixed race, biracial, but I made characters because there are places that my children and my family goes that I don't think those are my stories to tell.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make any sense? That's their personal tale.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jason, I wanted to go back and ask you a little bit about your inspiration. Also, when you're writing, I mean, I want to know about people inspiring you, or other artists inspiring you, but also when you're writing, what are you reading when you're writing? What kind of books do you read when you write?
So a little bit of everything. So I'm a bit obsessive in that I am constantly like what keeps me coming back to the page is not just the stories and not just sort of the kids and like that's a huge part of it, but there's the other thing that happens for me, which is I am obsessed about the possibility of language. That's it. Like I believe in a kind of alchemy. I believe that I wonder if we could, like, what can we really do with language? Like what kinds of spells could be cast? What kinds of bonds could be broken, right? What kinds of bridges could be built? What kinds of homes could be roofed? Like what could we do with a few words? I mean, I think about Quincy Jones, who is a big inspiration for me. And one of his famous quotes is, it's been 700 years and it's 700 years of recorded music and we just have 12 notes. Right? Like what an incredible thing to think about, right? There's 12 notes and we got 700 years of recorded music with the rearrangement of just 12 notes, right? And so when I think about Toni Morrison, and I think about Ali Smith, who I think is a grossly underrated writer in America. The rest of the world knows she's brilliant, but I think about Ali Smith, I think about Langston Hughes, I think about Jean Toomer, I think about Gail Jones and Fran Ross and all these people. I mean, Alice Walker, all these people who understood that language is more than it's not to be played with. Like it's not. I was with Nikki Finney 2 months ago. Nikki Finney, the great poet, and she said, Jason, in the 1880s, they would have, if they caught a Black person reading or writing, specifically writing, they would take your eyes, take your hands, take your feet, right? All these things, because they understood the power of language and what could be done if we truly understood how to wield it, how to manipulate it. And so the reason I keep coming back to the page, and the reason that I read everything, and I'm constantly studying and writing notes and picking apart everything and arguing with my friends who are angry with me for me telling them that they should work harder and all these things, is because I truly believe in the alchemy of language, truly. And I'm trying to figure out, like John Coltrane tried to find the phone, right? Like the blues musicians trying to find the blue note, I'm trying to figure out what exactly are my capabilities with the vocabulary that I have.
Great. That's great. Vashti, I wanted to ask you about the reactions that you receive from your books. Can you think of are there any favorite reactions that you've had from any of the kids that have encountered your books, whether you've visited them or not, seen them or not?
Yeah. I say this no matter where I go. I have a soft spot for the artists. I always read the stories of artists in my books when I do school visits. Those are the ones that are usually my favorites because I feel like I identify with them in just incredibly integral ways. And so the stories I remember the most of the kids that I meet are the ones who are inspired to draw after I do my little drawing demo, and they come up and they show me, or when I get emails of like a parent saying like, my kids started drawing when they came home from school that day and they haven't stopped. Because I remember being that little kid in my, literally sitting in the corner and just drawing pictures and like, I grew up in a very small town in Virginia, and there was like little hope that, many people would ever leave that town. I mean, I don't think I'm exaggerating. Like a lot of people end up staying there. And so I always, I felt like I always was trying to, build my own world of fantasy within my drawings and within the stories that I was making up when I was a little kid. And so, that part of it, it just like, it pulls me back to being that, that little girl. So when I see these kids and they've shown me their drawings and they're practicing and they're getting like really good and they're listening to me when I it's not about talent. It's not about some like born talent that some people have and some people don't. I tell them every time, like, you just have to practice. Look at this hard work that you've put into it. So that means so much to me, because I feel like, to me, that's where my stories come from. I haven't published anything other than nonfiction, but my heart is in story. That's where all my drawings come from. And so when I see kids that are like making up all of these different things, it feels like that's just the beginning of storytelling. And I get so excited about it. I was at the Boys Club of New York a few months ago, and I did my whole presentation. And this one kid wanted to show me his drawings, and he was so scared that I was going to leave. And I was like, I'm not going to leave. Come, because in my presentation I said I used to sit down in front of the TV and copy my favorite characters, and it was before you could pause the TV. And I would just make up my own versions of it. I would make up my own Pokemon, and they were like, Pokemon was on TV when you were a kid? And I was like, yes, I'm not that old. Pokemon's not that old. And he came up and he was so scared he wanted to show me his drawings. And he had page after page after page of all these Pokemon he had created himself. And he started coloring some in with ink and some with pencil. And I was just so proud of what I saw, because I know that what was going on within his head was just all of this storytelling. He was building his own world. He was creating his own cast of characters. And so that's the thing that's most exciting for me. And so, my second book, Little Dreamers, is the stories of creative people. It's women artists and scientists. And so, within it, it's filmmakers and it's painters and photographers. And those are like the ones that got me so excited when I was little. So to know that, these 8-year-olds are growing up knowing the name of like Maya Deren and like Julie Dash and Augusta Savage, it feels so exciting, because that's how I learned how to express myself.
Right.
And, yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Karyn, can I add a point? I think it's so interesting. There's just the three of us and how we're using history and telling different truths. And Jason's comments really struck me, because I was part of the generation too that helped create African American studies within the academy. And I got to know Tony and meet Alice Walker when that explosion was happening. But my sense of storytelling comes from my grandmother and telling stories on the porch, because she raised me. But also my family told all kinds of not so good lies. They're good lies, which I tell now, and a lot of not so good lies. So I was possessed by the untold stories that needed to be told, because that was part of my background. And then moving towards, a new generation, in the alchemy of the language that came afterwards from all these wondrous writers. And then Vashti, you creating this merging of history and art and illustration. And I think that just the diversity of us and where we come from and where we've been and how we've grown is more times more is what the world needs. So kids, it's not representation, as you say, in a way. It's about truth, and we have truths that are adjacent or connected to the time in which we live in and how we were grown and how we were born. And that diversity, kids can know that anything is all right. Being anything is just fine. I don't know. Sorry, that's crazy.
Oh, no, it's so beautiful. You're such an inspiration. Thank you so much. I love that. But it looks like we're a little bit close on time, but I want to make sure everyone has enough time for this next question, which is really, I want you all, if you can, and start with Vashti and go then Jason and then Jewell. If you can, tell me a little bit about what you're working on now. Is that possible to tell me a little bit about what you're doing now?
Yeah. What am I not working on now? I made clay pots yesterday. I made jewelry the day before, and I'm writing a ton of things.
Have you been making a lot of things physically right now?
Yes, I've been trying to kind of, we talked a little bit before we started recording about this weird time we're in. I mean, it's this Everywhere Book Festival is going to be like a document of this interesting moment. We are all kind of faced with creating from within our own homes. And I normally do this. I normally work from here, but somehow I'm feeling a lot of different pressure on my own self to get a lot done in the next, couple of months, because I want to write 1,000 things. So I am working on I'm working on, my first written and illustrated picture book, another picture book idea. I'm illustrating 2 other picture books that are coming down the pipe with publishers. I'm potentially an illustrated middle grade novel, and then it feels like that is a lot. And I felt like I was putting too much pressure on myself, so I stopped putting so much pressure on myself and said, I'm going to make some jewelry for a few hours. So I did that, and I drew some with pastels, and I've just been making stuff that's not to share with anyone, and it's not to promote. It's just to express myself creatively. So it's a weird time.
No, that's good to hear. What about you, Jason?
I'm actually trying to write a fable. I think for some reason over the last 10 years, the word allegory has become a bad word in children's literature. And I think that's silly. I think it's just about how you do it, right? And I think didacticism is ridiculous, but allegory isn't a bad thing. If it's done with a deft hand. And so I think it's time that we start to make new fables. Why not? Like our whole lives are built around fairy tales. Why can't we continue to make them? And so I'm working on a new one.
That's fantastic. Jewell?
Oh, they've inspired me. I was complaining that it was hard to write now during this era of the pandemic, but I am writing, and I'm working on a book called Paradise on Fire. And it really is about Paradise, California, climate change, wildfires. And it's also about how for a lot of inner city kids, urban kids, they don't know that they're maybe great wilderness explorers. They don't know that they can kayak or climb mountains, or that they can be part of a landscape. I think it's one of America's other tragedies that, the amount of minority kids who go to our national parks is very, very few and far between. So it's about a city kid who learns about themselves, their strength, and their landscape, and help save lives during the Paradise Fire. And I'm working on, because I do a lot of thinking and reading, another big classic of American world literature that I've been asked to do for a possible movie thingy. So that one's kind of like under wraps, but I'm sort of like taking, maybe it's like a little bit like the fables, or taking a classic and reworking it for our times. And Jason, one time we'll have to talk too, and also Vashti, because I also think about the canon of the Brer Rabbit stories, Henry Louis Gates, who came out with these wonderful stories, and how that they need an updating, ways in which we can continue to do, literary trends of the past, but making them new, or taking those 12 notes that Jason was talking about and just working them in a new way for 2020.
For sure.
Great.
What about you, Karyn?
Well, what am I working on?
Yeah,
hey, Karyn, what are you working on?
Yes, Karyn.
I'm working on my second book, and so I'm a mess. But I'm working on it's another historical fiction novel. But this takes place in the 70s, and I don't really, not really up for saying a lot more about it, because I feel like it still feels like it's in flux, and but that's about. Yeah, that's about that.
Remember to be kind to yourself. I think sometimes it's very hard to write that second book, But just remember, you be kind to yourself. You're so talented, and revision makes everything better. So yeah,
Right, right.
your first book was utterly brilliant. So you're just
Thank
going to follow right along, and best wishes to you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank all of you. Thank you for letting me do this and for being so wonderful. And thank you everybody who joined us at Black Voices Matter, at the Black Voices Matter panel at Everywhere Book Fest. Thanks, guys.
Later. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.